So can everyone hear me? Yes, well, that's all right then, isn't it? Now, I'd like to invite everyone to what I believe is the 22nd meeting of the New Right. And just for those newish faces amongst you, I'd like to explain what the New Right is, bearing in mind that there are many, many New Rights all over the world. The New Right was formed 2004-2005. It's essentially a forum for free debate and discussion, particularly about issues that are not discussed or can't be discussed anywhere else. There's a wide variety of speakers have addressed this gathering. Mr. Irving, who will be speaking after me, has addressed it once before. All sorts of other people, an advisor to President Putin of Russia, Alexander Dugin, once addressed us on interesting concepts in relation to the geopolitics of the Russian Federation. We've had some Islamic speakers. We've had dissident speakers of all sorts. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending upon your view, I've spoken at every one of these gatherings on some metapolitical or cultural matter. The point of the New Right is to support all discourses that pretend to inequality. And if the right believes in anything, it believes in the moral goodness of inequality in all forms. And therefore we support discourse that manifests inegalitarianism and inequality. No sectarianism along party allegiances of any sort, within the rightist elements in the Conservative Party and out to as far as you can get, going rightwards and coming back again. We don't permit any of that. And we also request that all speakers are listened to in relative silence, but applause can occasionally break out. Now, the point of the New Right is essentially to focus paradigmatically various inegalitarian ideas of a Mosleyite type, of a pan-European type, of a British nativist type, of a British nationalist type, of a post-fascistic type, of an ultra-nationalist type, of a neo-fascist type, of a revisionist type, and all sorts of other types. We've had pagan speakers, we've had Christian speakers, we've had different orientations. We're not biased about the spiritual system that people choose to adopt or express their European identity through. Now, it could be said that the New Right, unlike the New Right in France, is not a codified intellectual or ideological group like the Benoits. For those who are aware of Grèce and its activities in relation to a righteous response to the leftist events of 1968, which convulsed Europe and France in particular, Grèce came together to form a sort of new hard right ideology growing out of the ultra-right traditions in France that had pre-existed it. Over time, it developed a quite coherent body of theory associated with its leading thinkers like de Benoit and Guillaume Faye. The idea was you either agreed with them or left, and it retained the sectarian, intellectual and ideological profile of much of the French right. Don't forget, the 68 events were influenced by tiny little leftist vanguard groups. Some of them syndicalists, some of them left anarchists, some of them Maoists, some of them splits from the modernist movement of surrealism founded by André Breton earlier in the century. We are a different type of group to that. We don't have a completely coherent line, therefore people are not expelled, there isn't an ideological conformity, there isn't really an editorialism. But what we want over time is to provide that which the universities or the tertiary sector of our educational system will never do. And that is to debate those issues that can be looked at from the right. De Benoit wrote a book called View from the Right, Vue de la Droite, and we wish to view and analyse everything, including the history of the last century, including the Second European Civil War between 1939 and 1945, in a way that would not be permitted in London University, Cambridge University, Glasgow University, Oxford University, or elsewhere. If seminars existed that manifested the sort of views that are expressed here, this group would have no real purpose. But because our tertiary system hounds out any academic who puts forward some of the views contained in these volumes before me on this table, there is a need for a group like this. Now, I'm the chairman of the New Right. This is being filmed. Various people initiated it 3 to 4 years ago. It will have an actual life as all such groups do. When there's nothing more to say, or when larger currents of opinion have taken it up, then it will have served its purpose. I was, for a while, for 4 years, the cultural officer of the British National Party, as is reasonably widely known, which of course has had a breakthrough into the European Parliament, but this is not a group associated with any party or any tendency. And even in relation to that party, I was a bit of an outrider of various sorts, even then. Now, for my speech, I would like to talk about something that has always interested me. The title of the talk is Léon Degrelle, the real Tintin, but what I really want to talk about is the heroic in mass and in popular culture. It's interesting to note that heroic ideas and ideals have been disprivileged by pacifism, by liberalism tending to the left, and by feminism, particularly since the social and cultural revolutions of the 1960s. And yet the heroic, as an imprimatur in Western society, has gone down into the depths, into mass popular culture, often into trashy forms of culture, where the critical insight of various intellectuals doesn't particularly gaze upon it. One of the forms that interests me about the continuation of the heroic in Western life as an idea is the graphic novel. A despised form, particularly in Western Europe, outside France and Italy, and outside Japan, further east. It's regarded as a form primarily for children and for adolescents. And yet, forms such as this, these are 2 volumes of Tintin, which almost everyone has come across in some time or other, 50 languages other than the original French. These books, stroke graphic novels, stroke cartoons, stroke comic books have been translated into. They've sold 200 million copies, which is almost scarcely believable. It basically means sort of a significant proportion of the globe's population has got one of these volumes somewhere. Now, before he died, Léon Degrelle said that the character of Tintin, created by Hergé, was based upon his example. Other people rushed to say that this wasn't true and that this was self-publicity by a notorious man, and so on and so forth. Probably, like all artistic and semi-artistic things, there's an element of truth to it. Because a character like this, that's eponymous and archetypal, will be a synthesis of all sorts of things. Hergé got out of these dilemmas by saying it was based upon a member in his family, and so on, and that's probably as true as not. Now, the idea of the masculine and the heroic and the Homeric in modern guise sounds absurd when it's put in tights and appears in a superhero comic and that sort of thing. But the interesting thing is, because these forms of culture are so quote-unquote low, they're off the radar of that which is acceptable, and therefore certain values can come back. It's interesting to note that the pulp novels in America in the 1920s and 30s, which preceded the so-called golden age of comics in the United States in the 30s and 40s, and the silver age in the 1960s, dealt with quite illicit themes. And one of the reasons that even today Tintin is mildly controversial and regarded as politically incorrect in certain circles is they span much of the 20th century. Everyone who's alive now realises that there was a social and cultural revolution in the Western world in the 1960s, where almost all the values of a relatively traditional European society, whatever side it fought on in the Second World War, were overturned and reversed in a mass reversion or re-evaluation of values from a new leftist perspective. Before 1960, many things which are now legal, and so legal that to criticise them has become illegal, were themselves illicit and outside of the pedigree and pattern of Western law, custom, practice and social tradition. We've seen a complete reversal of nearly all of the ideals that prevailed then. This is why many items of quite popular culture are illicit. If one just thinks of a silent film like D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation in 1915, there was a prize awarded by the American Motion Picture Academy up until about 1994 in Griffith's name. For those who don't know, the second part of Birth of a Nation is neo-Confederate in orientation, depicts the Ku Klux Klan as heroic. Heroic! And the Ku Klux Klan regarded as the heroes saving the white South from perdition, from the carpetbaggers, some of whom bear an extraordinary resemblance to the present President of the United States of America. Now, regarded as the heroes saving the white South from perdition, from the carpetbaggers, some of whom bear an extraordinary resemblance to the present President of the United States of America. Now, and of course they were called carpetbaggers because they were mulatto politicians who arrived in the South, primarily from the North, with certain abolitionist sponsorship, and they arrived with everything they owned in a carpet bag to take over, and that's why they were called that. Now, that film, which you can get in any DVD store and buy off the Amazon, for example, for £10 or so, is extraordinarily notorious. But in actual fact, in terms of its iconography, it's a heroic, dualist film where there's a force of darkness and a force of light. There's a masculine individual, there's people who believe that they sort out problems with a gun. The Bible, in an ultra-Protestant way, is their text. It's what they base metaphysical objectivism and absolute value upon. And that film is perceived retrospectively as an extreme right-wing film. Although Griffiths himself was later to do a film called Intolerance, and actually, like a lot of filmmakers, had quite a diverse range of views, irrespective of his own Southern and Texan background. The thing one has to remember is that the methodology of the heroic can survive, even if people fight against various forces in Western life. One of the great tricks of the heroic in the last 40 to 50 years is that heroic films, involving icons like Clint Eastwood, for example, as a successor to the sort of archetype of John Wayne and the sort of Western stylized masculinity that he represented. Eastwood often plays individualistic, survivalist and authoritarian figures, right-wing existentialist figures. But they're always at war with bureaucracies and values that are perceived as conservative. One of the basic tricks which has occurred since the 1960s is to reorient the nature of the heroic so that the internal radical right within a society, such as the United States or elsewhere, is the enemy, per se. There's a comic strip in the United States called Captain America, which began in the 1940s. Captain America is a weedy young man who almost walks with a stick and has arms like branches. And of course, a friendly American scientist introduces him to a new secret program where he's injected with sort of steroids and this sort of thing, and immediately becomes this enormous, blonde, hulking Superman with blue eyes. And of course, he must dress himself in the American flag, so he can call himself Captain America. So you get the idea. And he has a big shield which has the star of the United States on it, and he has a sidekick who dies in one of the 1930s or 40s comics. But of course, these figures never die, they're endlessly brought back. But there's a problem here, because the position that Captain America and the lesser Marvel Comics equivalent called Captain Britain and all of these other people represent is a little bit suspect in an increasingly liberal society, even then. So his enemy, his nemesis, his dualist alternative has to be a Nazi. And of course, Captain America has a Nazi enemy who's called the Red Skull. And the Red Skull is a man with a hideous face who, to hide this hideousness, wears a hideous mask over his hideous face as a double take. You know, the mirror cracks, so why not wear a mask? But it's not a mask of beauty, but it's a skull that's painted red, and he's called the Red Skull. And he always wears green, so it's red and green. And he always appears, and there's always a swastika somewhere in the background and that sort of thing, and he's always building robots or cyborgs or new biological sort of creatures to take over the world, and Captain America always succeeds in vanquishing him in the last panel, just in the last panel. The Red Skull is always about to triumph until the fist of Captain America for the American way and the American dream comes in at the end. Now, this mantle of the heroic, whereby right-wing existentialists like Captain America fight against the extreme right in accordance with democratic values, is one of the interesting tricks that's played with the nature of the heroic, because the heroic is a dangerous idea. And whether or not Tintin was based on Léon Degrelle, there is a quasi-fascistic element to the nature of the heroic, which many writers of fantasy and science fiction, which began as a despised genre, but is now, because it's so commercially viable, one of the major European bookish genres, have always known this. Michael Moorcock, amongst others, speaks of the danger of subliminal rightism in much fantasy writing, where you can slip into an unknowing, an ultra-right-wing, an uncritical attitude towards the masculine, towards the heroic, towards the vanquishing of forces you don't like, towards self-transcendence, for example. There's a well-known novel called The Iron Dream. And this novel is, in a sense, depicting Hitler's rise to power and everything that occurred in the war that resulted thereafter as a science fiction discourse, as a sort of semiotic by a mad creator. And this book was actually banned in Germany because, although it's an extreme satire, which is technically very anti-fascistic, it can be read in a literal-minded way with the satire semi-detached. And this novel by Norman Spinrad was banned for about 20 to 30 years in West Germany, as it then was, because fantasy enables certain people to have an irony bypass. Although comics are quite humorous, particularly to adults, children and adolescents read them, scan them, because they sort of look at the images and sort of just take in the balloons as they go across, because these are films on paper. They essentially scan them in an uncritical way. If you ever look at a child, particularly a child that's got very little interest in formal literature of a sort that's taught in many European and American schools, they sit absorbed before comics, absolutely enthralled by the nature of them, by the absolute villainy of the transgressor, by the total heroicism and absence of irony and sarcasm of the heroic figure, with the scantily clad maiden on the front that the hero always addresses himself to, but usually in a dismissive way, because he's got heroic things to accomplish, but she's always on his arm, or on his leg, or being dragged down. Indeed, the pulp depiction of women, which of course is deeply politically incorrect, and vampish, and this sort of thing, is a source of great amusement in these genres. If you ever look at comics like Conan the Barbarian, or Iron Man, or the Incredible Hulk, and these sorts of things, the hero will always be there, in the middle, never to the side, always in the middle, four square, facing the future. The villain will always be off to one side, often on the left, the side of villainy, you know? The side of the sinister, that which wants to drag down and destroy. And as he's about to, the Hulk is about to hit the leader, which is his nemesis, or Captain America's about to hit the Red Skull, which is his nemesis, or Batman's about to hit the psychiatric clown called the Joker, who's his nemesis, and so on. There's always a scantily clad woman who's round his leg on the front cover, sort of looking up in a pleading sort of way, as the fist is back here. And it's quite clear that these are archetypal male attitudes of amusement and play, which of course have their danger to many of the assumptions that took over in the 1960s and 70s. It's interesting to notice that in the 1930s, quite a lot of popular culture expressed openly vigilante notions about crime. There was a pulp magazine called The Shadow that Orson Welles played on the radio. And Orson Welles didn't believe in learning the part. At New York radio, Wells, usually the worst for wear for drink and that sort of thing, would steam up to the microphone, he would take the script and just launch into The Shadow straight away. The Shadow used to torment criminals, and the nastier they were, the more he'd torment them. When he used to kill them or garrote them or throttle them or hang them, these pulps were quite violent, and unashamedly so. He used to laugh uproariously like a psychopath. And indeed, if you didn't get the message, there would be lines in the book saying ha 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 for several lines, you know, as he actually did people in. There was Batman in some ways is the prototype, so the Shadow is the prototype for Batman who comes along later. Batman is, as certain Marxian cultural critics in a discourse called Cultural Studies have pointed out, Batman is a man who dresses himself up in leathers to torment criminals at night and looks for them when the police, namely the state, the authority, in a fictional New York called Gotham City, put a big light in the sky saying, come and torment the criminal class. They put this big bat symbol up in the sky and he drives out in the Batmobile looking for villains to torment. As most people are aware, comics morphed into more adult forms in the 1980s and 90s, and a graphic novel emerged called Dark Knight, which explored in quite a sadistic and ferocious way Batman's desire to punish criminality in a very extreme way. There was also a pulp in the 1930s called Doc Savage. Most people have vaguely heard of these things because their Hollywood films have been made on and off about all these characters. Doc Savage was an enormous blonde who was 7 feet, who was bronzed with the sun and covered in rippling muscles. Indeed, to accentuate his musculature, he wore steel bands around his wrists and ankles, as you do. He was a scientist of genius, a poet of genius, a musician of genius. In fact, there's nothing that he wasn't a genius about. He was totally uninterested in women. He also had a research institute that operated on the brains of criminals in order to reform them. This is quite extraordinary and deeply politically incorrect. He would not only defeat the villain at the end of the story, he would drag them off to this hospital/institute for them to be operated on, so that they could be redeemed for the nature of society. In other words, he was a eugenicist. And of course, those sorts of ideas in the 1930s were quite culturally acceptable, because we are bridging different cultural perceptions, even at the level of mass entertainment, within the Western world. that which is regarded, even by the time Clockwork Orange was made by Kubrick from Burgess's novel in the 1970s, as appalling, 40 years before was regarded as quite acceptable. So the shifting sands of what is permissible, who can enact it, and how they are seen is part and parcel of how Western people define themselves. Don't forget, 40% of the people in Western societies don't own a book. Therefore, these popular mass forms, which in one way are intellectually trivial, is in some respects how they perceive reality. Comics, like films, have been heavily censored. In the United States in the 1950s, there was an enormous campaign against various sorts of quasi-adult comics that were very gory and were called horror comics and were produced by a very obscure form called Entertainment Corporation, EC. And there was a surrogate for the Un-American Activities Committee in the US Senate looking at un-American comics that are getting at our kids. And they had a large purge of these comics. Indeed, mountains of them were burnt. Indeed, enormous sort of semi-book burnings occurred. Great big, pyramids of comics as big as this room, as big as the skyline up there, would be burnt by US and federal marshals on judges' orders because they contain material that the young shouldn't be looking at. And the material they shouldn't be looking at was grotesque, gory, beyond Roald Dahl sort of explicit material, which of course children love. They adore all that sort of thing because it's exciting, because it's imaginative, because it's brutal, because it takes you out of the space of normality, and that's why the young, with their instincts of passion and glory, love this sort of completely unmediated, amoral fare. And that's why there's always been this tension between what their parents would like them to like and what many, particularly late childish boys and adolescents, really want to devour. I remember Evelyn Waugh was once asked, what was your favourite book when you were growing up? And just like a flash, she said, Captain Blood. Captain Blood! Which of course is, imagine any silent pirates film from the 1920s and early 30s. Now, the heroic in Western society takes many forms. When I grew up, there were these tiny little comics in A5 format. Everyone must have seen them, certainly any boy from the 1960s and 70s. They were called Battle. Battle and Commando and war comics and these sorts of things. They were done by D.C. Thompson, which is the biggest comics manufacturer in Britain, up in Dundee. And these comics were very unusual because they allowed extremely racialist and nationalist attitudes. But the enemies were always Germans, and they were always Japanese. Indeed, long after the passing of the Race Act in the late 1960s and its follow-up, which was more codified and definitive and legally binding in the 1970s, statements about Germans and Japanese could be made in these sorts of comics, which were not just illicit, but illegal. You know what I mean, the Green Berets, the Commandos would give it to quote-unquote Jerry in a sort of arcane sort of British way, and were allowed to. This was permitted, even in its liberal transgression, because the enemy was of such a sort. But of course, what's being celebrated is British fury and ferocity, and the nature of British warriors and the Irish Guards not taking prisoners, and this sort of thing. This is what's being celebrated in these sorts of comics. It's noticeable that D.C. Thompson, who had no connection with the DC group in the United States, by the way, toned down this element in the comics as they went along. Only Commando survives, but they still produce 4 of them a month. In the 1970s, Thompson, who also did the Beano, an utterly childish material for children of about 5 or 6 as well, as part of the great spectrum of their group, decided on some riskier, more transgressive, more punkish, more adult material. And so they created a comic called Attack. Attack! And it was this large shark that used to come and devour people. It was quite good. The editor would disapprove of somebody, and they would be eaten by the shark, And there was the marvellous balloons they had in comics. There was something like, this shark is amoral. It eats. And there'd be a human leg sticking out of the mouth of the shark, some individual that the editor disapproved of and that was going down the gullet. Now, Attack was attacked in Parliament. A Labour MP got up and said he didn't like Attack. It was rather dubious. It was tending in all sorts of unwholesome directions. And Attack had a story that did outrage a lot of people in the middle 1970s, because there was a story where a German officer from the Second World War was treated sympathetically in attack because he was transgressive, you see. What's going to get angry Methodists writing to their local paper? A comic that treats some Wehrmacht officer in a sympathetic light. So D.C. Thompson, there was a real rumpus under Wilson's government in about 75 about this, and so they removed that. And various writers like Pat Mills and John Wagner were told to come up with something else. So they came up with the comic that became Judge Dredd. And Judge Dredd is a very interesting comic in various ways, because all sorts of left-wing people don't like Judge Dredd at all, even though it's a satire. Dredd is anywhere, as people who don't know this, Dredd drives around in a sort of motorcycle helmet with a slab-sided face, which is just human meat, really, and he's an ultra-American, and it's set in a dystopian future where New York is extended to such a degree that it covers about, sort of a quarter of the landmass of the United States. You just live in a city, a bird, and you go and you go and you go. There's total collapse. There's no law and order, and there's complete unemployment, and everyone's bored out of their mind. The comic's based upon the interesting notion that crime is partly triggered by boredom and sort of wantonness in the masses. Therefore, in order to keep any sort of order, the police and the judiciary have combined into one figure called a judge. So the jury, the trial, the police investigation, and the investigative and forensic elements are all combined in the figure of the judge. So if Judge Dredd's driving along a street and he sees some youths of indeterminate ethnicity breaking into a store, he says, "Hold, citizens! This is the law! I am the law! Obey me! Obey the law!" And if they don't, he shoots them dead. Because the trial's syncopated into about 20 seconds. He's given them the warning. That's why it's called Judge Dredd, you see, D-R-E-D-D. And he just kills, automatically, those who transgress. And there's great early comic strips where he roars around on this bike that has this sort of skull-like front. And he appears, and there's a chap parking his car, and he says, "Citizen, traffic violation, 9 years." And roars off somewhere else. And so there's thieving and this sort of thing, and he gets them and bangs their head into the street. There's no question of a sort of commission afterwards, 12 years in a cube, which is an isolation cell. It's got its own slang, because comics, of course, create their own world, which children and adolescents love, so you can totally escape into a world that's got a semiotic or a narrative of its own, that's closed to outsiders. Because if some adult picks it up and looks at it, you think, what is this about? Because it's designed to exclude you in a way. And Dredd has numerous adventures and in other dimensions and so on, but Dredd never changes, never becomes more complicated, remains still, has no friends. "I have no need of human attachments." Is what he says in a slightly marvellous line, He said, he has a robot for company who provides most of his meals and needs and that sort of thing. And for the rest, he's engaged in purposeful and pitiless implementation of law and order. One of his famous phrases is somebody asks him, "What is happiness?" And he says in one of those bubbles, "Happiness is law and order. Pleasure is obeying the law." And there's various people grovelling in chains in front of them. Now, there's been worried left-wing catcalls because, although it's a satire, and is quite clearly meant to be one, for example, very old people, because people in this fantasy world live so long that they want to die at the end and they go to be euthanized, so they all queue up for euthanasia and that sort of thing. And there's one story where somebody blows up the people waiting for euthanasia to quicken the thing, but also to protest against it. And Judge says, "Killing euthanides is terrorism. War on terror. Where have we heard that before?" And he roars off. And don't forget, these are people who want to die, but Dredd says they're being finished off too early. You've got to wait, citizen. And then wait to be killed later, by the syringe, that's coming. And then people are reprocessed as medicines. Because, everything can be used. It's a utilitarian society. Therefore, everything is used, from birth to death. Because the state arranges everything for you. Even though socialism is condemned completely, there's another bloc, because it's based on the Cold War idea, there's a Soviet bloc off on the other side of the world, that is identical to the West. Identical to the West. But ideologically, they're at war with each other, even though they're absolutely interchangeable with each other. But the Western metaphysic is completely pro-market, completely capitalist, but in actual fact no one works, and everyone's a slave to an authoritarian state. There's also an interesting parallel with more advanced forms of literature here. Clockwork Orange, many people think that's about Western Youth Rebellion and gangs of rockers and sort that emerged, and mobs who emerged in the 1960s at the time. Burgess wrote his linguistically sort of overextended work in many ways. In actual fact, Anthony Burgess wrote Clockwork Orange after a visit to the Soviet Union, where he was amazed to find that, unlike the totalitarian control of the masses which he expected at every moment, there was quite a degree of chaos, particularly amongst the lumpen proletariat in the Soviet Union. George Orwell in 1984 has an interesting idea, and that is that the proles are so beneath ideology, right at the bottom of the society, the bottom 3%, not even the bottom 10%, that they can be left to their own devices. They can be left to take drugs. They can be left to be drink to excess. They can be left to sort of destroy themselves. Orwell says the future is the proles at one point. Remember when Winston Smith looks out across the tenements and sees the enormous washerwoman putting some sheets on the line, and she sings about her lost love. Oh, he was an helpless fancy, she says, and all this, you know. And Winston looks out on her across the backyards and lots and says, if there's a future, it lies with the proles. And then he thinks to himself, but looking at them, he had to wonder, you know, but the party degrades the proletariat to such a degree that it ceases to be concerned about their amusements, because they're beneath the level of ideology, and therefore you don't need to control them. The people you control are the outer party, those who can think, those who wear the blue boiler suits, not the black ones, for the inner party. And this interconnection between mass popular culture, often of a very trivial sort, and elitist culture, whereby, more philosophically, the same ideas are expressed, is actually interesting. You suddenly get these lightning flashes that occur between absolutely sort of trash culture, if you like, and quite advanced forms of culture, like Clockwork Orange, like Darkness at Noon, like 1984, like The Iron Heel, like The Iron Dream, and these sorts of extraordinary dystopian and cacatopian novels, which are in some respects the political literature, high political literature, as literature, qua literature, of the 20th century. Now, one of the reasons for the intellectual independence of elements in comics is because no one's concerned about it, except when the baleful eye of censorship falls upon them. A particular American academic wrote a book in the early 1950s called The Seduction of the Innocent, which is about children were being depraved. They were being depraved by these comics, which were giving them violent and racialist and elitist and masculinist stereotypes, which shouldn't be allowed. And of course, the vogue for left-wing comics grew up in the 1970s. Because culture in the United States, particularly mass culture, is racially segregated in a way which is never admitted, African Americans have always had their own versions of these things. There are black American comics, Marvel did too, called The Black Panther. And the Black Panther only ever preys on villains who are black. And there's another one called Power Man, who's in prison and is loaded down with chains, and a white scientist who might be Jewish experiments on him. He's called Luke Cage, and he's experimented on him and suddenly becomes a behemoth, a titan of black strength he's called, and he backs down the wall and takes all sorts of people on. And yet, of course, all of the villains he takes on, very like the Shaft films, which are the Black James Bond films, which are very similar. All of this material is segregated, it occurs within its own zone. But you notice the same heroic archetypes return. Yet again, there's a villain in the corner, usually on the left side. Luke Cage has an enormous fist. There's a sort of half-caste beauty on his leg, looking up, saying, and this sort of thing. It's the same methodology. It's the same thing coming round again. So, although there have been attempts at the left-wing comic, it's actually quite difficult to draw upon with any effect, because in a way you can criticise comics that are metapolitically right-wing, but to create a left-wing one is actually slightly difficult. The way you get around it is to have a comic that's subliminally rightist and have the villain as the extreme right. There are two American comics called Sergeant Fury and Sergeant Rock, and another one's called Our Army at War, Sergeant Rock, you know, and this sort of thing. And you know who the villain is because they're all set in the Second World War. The attitude towards communism in comics is very complicated. Nuclear destruction was thought too controversial. And when formal censorship of American comics began in the 1950s, something called the Approved Comics Code Authority very like the British Board of Film Classification, emerged, and they would have a seal on the front of the comic. Like American films in the 1930s, men and women could kiss, but only in certain panels and only for a certain duration on the page as the child or adolescent looked at it. And it was understood so explicitly it didn't even need to be mentioned that, of course, it was totally heterosexual. Similarly, violence had to be kept to a minimum, but a certain allowed element of permissive cruelty was permitted if the villain was on the receiving end of it. Also, the comics had to be radically dualist. There has to be a force for light and a force for darkness. There has to be Spider-Man and his nemesis, who's Dr. Octopus. But a certain, who has 8 arms and this sort of thing and that sort of thing. But a certain complication can be allowed. And as comics grow, if you like, non-dualist characters emerge. There's a character in the Fantastic Four called Dr. Doom, who's a tragic figure with a ruined face, who is shunned by man, who wants to revenge himself on society because he's shut out, who ends as a ruler of a tiny little made-up European country, which he rules with an iron hand, and he does have hands of iron, so he rules his little Latvia substitute with an iron hand. But he's an outsider, you see, because in the comic he's a gypsy. He's a sort of white Roma. But he gets his own back through dreams of power. There's these marvellous lines in comics which, when you ventilate them, become absurd. But on the page, if you're sucked into the world, particularly as an adolescent boy, they live and thrive for you. Doom says to Reed Richards, who's his nemesis on the other side, "I am Doom! I will take the world." And this sort of thing, you know, because the way the hero gets back at the villain is to escape, because they're usually tied up somewhere with a heroine looking on expectantly. The hero's tied up, but because the villain talks so much about what they're going to do and the cruelty and appalling suffering they're going to inflict, all the time the hero's getting free, because you have to create a lacuna, a space, for the hero to escape, so he can drag the villain off to the asylum, or to the gibbet, or to the prison at the end. It's, do you remember that line from Lear on the Heath? "I shall do such things!" And what they are, I know not, but they will be the terror of the earth. And all these villains repeat that sort of line in the course of their discourse, because in a sense they had to provide the opening or the space for the hero to emerge. One of the icons of American cinema in the 20th century was John Wayne. And John Wayne was once interviewed about his political views. By, of all things, Playboy magazine, yes. Playboy asked John Wayne, this is the sort of level of culture we're dealing with. They said, "What are your political views?" And Wayne said, "Well," he said, "I'm a white supremacist." And there was utter silence when he said this. He was a member of the John Birch Society at the time. Whether or not he gave money to the Klan, no one really knows. There's always been a dissident strand in Hollywood, going back to Errol Flynn and before, of people who, if you like, started, even at the level of fantasy, living out some of these heroic parts in their own lives. Wayne, quite clearly, the distinction between fantasy on the film set and in real life was blurred on many occasions. There's many famous incidents of Wayne when robberies were going on, rushing out of hotels with guns in hand, saying, "Stick 'em up," you know, because he played that part, because every part's John Wayne, isn't it? Slightly differently. And he played that part again, except for a few comedy pieces, you know. He played that part again and again and again. Don't forget, The Alamo is now a politically incorrect film. Very politically incorrect. There's an enormous women's organisation in Texas called the Daughters of the Alamo. And they have to change their name, because the white supremacist celebration of the Alamo is offensive to Latinos, who are, or who will be very shortly, a Texan majority, don't forget. So the sands are shifting in relation to what is permitted, even within popular forms of culture. When Wayne said he was a supremacist in that way, he said, "I have nothing against other people, but we shouldn't hand the country over to them," is what he said. We shouldn't hand the country over to them. And don't forget, I was born, say, in 62. Obama in many of the deep southern states wouldn't have had the vote then. Now he's president. And this is how the West is changing on all fronts, and on every front. American whites will certainly be in a minority throughout the Federation in 40 to 50 years, certainly. Indeed, Clinton once justified, the male Clinton, the male of the species, once justified political correctness by saying, well, in 50 years we'll be in a minority. We noticed, we'll need political correctness to fight that game, you know. That the creator of Hergé, the creator of Tintin, Hergé, always said that his dreams and his nightmares were in white. His Nightmares were in wine. But we know that the politically correct games of the future will be whites putting their hands up in the air, complaining because somebody's made a remark, complaining because they haven't got a quota, complaining because this form is biased against them, and this sort of thing. They'll be playing the game that minorities in the West play at the moment, because that's all that's left to them. You know, you're given a slice of the ghetto, you predefine the culture, mass, middling and elite, in the past, but not into the future. Elements of the culture that are too much redolent of your past don't serve for the future and are therefore damned off and not permitted. And this is what, in a sense, white people face in America and elsewhere. One of the great mysteries of the United States that's produced an enormous amount of this mass culture, some of which I've been at times rather glibly describing, is why has there never been a mass, serious right-wing movement of the real right in the United States? The whole history of the 20th century and before would be different if that had occurred. Just think of it, not some sort of trivial group, but a genuine group. Don't forget, the real position of the American ultras is isolationism. They don't want to go out into the rest of the world and impose American neocolonialism on everyone else. They're the descendants of people who left the European dominion in order to create a new world. Hence the paradox that the further right you go in the United States, the more, not pacifist, but non-interventionist you become. Now, before the Confederacy, there was a movement called the Know-Nothings, which is, and this is often why very right-wing people in the United States are described as know-nothing. Because when you were asked about slavery, which of course was a very loaded and partial question, you said, well, I don't know anything about that. And that was a deliberate tactic to avoid being sucked into an abolitionist agenda or a way of speaking that was biased in the political correctness of its own era. But it is remarkable that although the Confederacy didn't have the strength to win, if they had won, the history of the whole world would be different. The 20th century would have never taken the course that it did. And one of the interesting things about the American psyche, of course, is that many unfortunate incidents, the war that we fought with the United States in 1812, for example, been completely elided from history. It's gone, it's gone. We almost went to war with them in 1896 over Venezuela, but still has slightly sort of interesting intonations even now, a century and more on, when Joseph Chamberlain was colonial secretary. This is again rather like the Suez incident in 1956. There are certain incidents that are played up and there are anniversaries that are every day on the television and that you can't escape from, but there are other anniversaries and other events that have been completely airbrushed from the spectrum and from the historical continuum, as if they never occurred. One episode is the extraordinarily bad treatment of prisoners of war by Americans. Going way, way back, the Confederates and the Unionists treated each other that way in the Civil War, but the Mexicans certainly got the boot in the 1840s, as did Spanish Cubans at the turn of the 20th century. Americans beat up every German on principle, including members of Adenauer's future cabinet, when they occupied part of Germany. They just regard that as de rigueur. And this frontier element that is there, crude and virile and ferocious, not always wrong, but ultimately fighting in ways which are not in the West's interest, certainly for much of the 20th century, just gone, is part and parcel of the heroic American sense of themselves. Where do all of these archetypes ultimately come from, the American popular culture, which has gone universal? Because the deal is that what America thinks today, the world thinks tomorrow. When we allegedly ruled the world, or parts of it, in the 19th century, Gladstone once stood in Manchester, in the Free Trade Hall, and said, what Manchester thinks today, the world thinks tomorrow. But now, it's what's on MTV or CNN today that the world would like to think is the ruling discourse of tomorrow. And American self-conceptuality is, to my mind, deeply, deeply Protestant, in every sense. And even at the lowest level of their popular culture, the idea of the heroic man, often a dissident police officer or a rancher or a hero of certain supernatural powers and so forth, but a man alone, a man outside the system, a man who's anti-establishment but who fights for order, a man who believes that everything's settled with a weapon, which is why they always carry large numbers of weapons, these sort of survivalist type heroes. All of these heroes, the ones created by Robert E. Howard, the ones such as Doc Savage, and Justice Incorporated and The Shadow, and all of the superheroes like Batman. Superman's interesting. Superman is Nietzschean ideas reduced to 1,000 levels of sub-intellectuality, isn't it? That's what's going on. He has a girlfriend who never ages, called Lois Lane, who looks 22 now, even though she's about 88, in the trajectory of the script. There's a villain who's bald and called Lex Luthor, who's always there, always the nemesis, always plotting. Luthor's reinvented later in the strip as a politician who takes over the city. Superman's clean and wholesome, you see, whereas the villain becomes a politician. You can see the sort of the rhetoric. Luthor and Superman in the stories are outsiders. They're both extraterrestrials. Luthor, however, has anti-humanist values, which means he's evil. Whereas Superman, who's partly human, has humanist values. Luthor comes out with amazing things, particularly in the 1930s comics, which are quite interesting, particularly given the ethnicity of the people who create Superman. Now, about half of American comics are very similar to the film industry. And a similar ethnicity is in the film industry as is in the comics industry. And part of the notions of what is right and wrong, what is American and what is not, is defined by that particular grid. Luthor's an ultra-humanite. Luthor has always these thuggish villains who have several teeth missing and are sort of Lombrosian. They're ugly and have broken noses and slanty hats. You know, this is the 1930s. And Luthor says, I'm sick of the human. He says, we've got to transcend the human. They don't have words like transcending comics. They say, go beyond or something. You know? We've got to go beyond the human. Humans have got to go. I've got to replace them with a new species. And one of his thugs will say, way to go, Luthor. This is what we want. Because if you notice, you have a comic called Superman. But Superman has liberal values and fights for democracy in the American way. And Luthor, although no one ever says, is fascistic, quote unquote. He's harsh, he's elitist, he's inegalitarian. You know that the villains always have a tendency to punish their own men? You remember Blofeld in the Bond films? One of his own minions will fail him, and he'll sit in a chair, and you know what's going to happen. The hand strokes the cat, you know, with the gold, with the diamonds round its neck. You know, the villain likes cats, you know, and the cat's eyes stare on, and the finger quivers over the button, and Blofeld or Luthor or Doctor Doom or the Red Skull or the Joker or whoever it is, because it's the same force really, says, you failed me. You failed me. There is only one punishment in this organisation. Click, the button goes and there's an explosion, the bloke screams, goes down in the chair. There's a great scene in Thunderball at the beginning where the chair comes up again that's empty and steaming. And all the other cronies are all readjusting their ties, you know. The bloke all sat there, and the camera always pans to his hands, the hands of power, you know, the hands of death, the hands of Zeus, the hands of Henry VIII, you know. The closet would meet, and they'd all be disarmed by guards, but he would have a double-headed axe down by the chair. It's said by American propaganda that Saddam Hussein once shot his Minister for Health during a Revolutionary Command Council meeting, and the same script had to be continued in the meeting by the Deputy Minister of Health. Just think how the Deputy Minister felt. Let's hope he wasn't wearing grey flannels, because they might have been brown by the end of the cabinet session. But this idea of dualism, moral dualism, ultimately a deeply Christian idea in many ways, or also a Zoroastrian idea, is cardinal for the morality of these comics, and the popular films, and TV serials, and all their internet spin-offs, and all of these computer games. Because even when the hero's a woman, like Laura Croft and so on, it's the same methodology coming round and round again, because adolescent boys want to look at somebody who looks like Laura Croft as she runs around with guns in both hands and virtually nothing on, you know. And that's the sort of dissident archetype in these American pulps, going back a long way. So just the feminisation of heroic masculinity, actually, which is what these sort of Valkyries are, in popular terms. Now, the dualist idea that there's a force for evil and a force for good, and we know who they are. They're the ones out there. In the Hulk is green, because he's affected by gamma rays. And the Hulk alternates with a brilliant scientist, but when he's in his monstrous incarnation, because of course it's a simplification of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in Robert Louis Stevenson's myth. And the Hulk is incredibly stupid, particularly early on in the comics. He's incredibly stupid. If he saw this table in front of him, he'd say, table, don't like table, and he'd smash it, because Hulk smashes. That's what he does. He smashes, you know. And the villain in the Hulk is called the Leader. The Leader is the villain. And the Leader is all brain. Indeed, the Leader has such a long head that he's almost in danger of falling over because of the size of his brain. So he has to wear, like children have to wear a steel brace on their teeth, the Leader wears a steel brace on his head because he's too bright. So the Leader, notice the Leader's a slightly quasi-fascistic, right-wing, elitist figure, isn't he? The man who wants to dominate through his mind is counterposed by just brute force, the Hulk. And this idea that there's a force for good and a force for evil, and the one always supplants the other, but the one can never defeat the other. Because the Leader in the Hulk, the Owl in Daredevil, the Joker in Batman, Doctor Doom in the Fantastic Four, Dr. Octopus in the Green Goblin, another green one, comes back in Spider-Man. They never destroy. If one of them's destroyed, their son finds their mask in a trunk and puts it on and knows that he wants to dominate the world, right? And comes back again, because they can never be destroyed, because they're archetypes. But comics hint at a sort of pagan non-dualism, partly because they insist upon this good and evil trajectory so much. And that's in some ways when they become quite morally complicated and quite dangerous. In Greek tragedy, a moral system exists, but it's preordained, but you have the fate partly in your own hands, even though it's decided by the gods. In the Osteia, by Aeschylus, you have a tragedy in a family, cannibalism, destruction, self-devouring, which is revenged and passed through into future generations. So that the Greek fleet can get to Troy, a girl, Iphigenia, is sacrificed. Clytemnestra avenges herself as a Medusa, as a Gorgon, against her husband who's killed her own daughter. And then, of course, there's a cycle of revenge and pity in the absence of pity, when the son, Orestes, who identifies with the father, comes back. In this type of culture, of obviously a much higher level conceptually, it's noticeable that the good character and the evil character are alive, are differentiated, merge in, replace one another, and separate over the three plays in that particular trilogy. If you look at real life, and you consider any conflict between men, Northern Ireland in the 1970s, we're British here, many people here are British nationalists. But if you notice, the IRA guerrilla, terrorist paramilitary, the loyalist guerrilla, terrorist paramilitary. One of my grandfathers was in the Ulster Volunteer Force at the beginning of the 20th century, but I went to a Catholic school. And Nietzsche has a concept called perspectivalism, whereby certain sides choose you in life. Certain things are prior ordained. When the US Marine fights the Islamist radical in Fallujah, say, the iconography of an American comic begins to collapse. Because which is the good one and which is the evil one? The average middle American, as he's sat reading Captain America and zapping the channels, thinks that the Marine is the good one, you know, with the 30 attention sort of attention span. But at the same time, the Marine isn't an incarnation of evil. He's a man fighting for what he's been told to fight for. He's a warrior, there's flies in his eyes, he's covered in sweat, he's going to kill someone who opposes him. But the radical on the other side is the same. And he sees that he's fighting for his people and the destiny of his faith. And when warriors fight each other, often there's little hatred left afterwards because it's expended in the extraordinary ferocity of the moment. And this is when this type of mass culture, amusing and interesting and entertaining though it is, begins to fall away. Because whenever we've gone to war, and we've gone quite a lot over the last 10 to 12 years, Blair's wars as well in Kosovo, there's the bombing of the Serbs, Milosevic is depicted as evil. Remember those slogans in the Sun? Bomb Milosevic's bed, bomb his bed, bomb his house, you know, and this sort of thing. Saddam, you know, we're going to string him up, you know. The man's a war criminal. The fact he'd been applying to the West for years, you know, didn't seem to come into it. Hanged, showed extreme bravery in a way, even though, if you weren't a Sunni in Iraq, definitely, he wasn't exactly your man. But there is a degree to which the extraordinary demonisation of the other, which works. That's why it's used. The British National Party won 2 seats in that election, but there was a campaign against it for 12 to 15 days before in almost every item of media, irrespective of ideological profile, saying don't vote for these people. To get rid of the softer protest votes, you're only left with the hardcore. That's what it's used. That's why that type of ideology is used. Maybe humans are hardwired to see absolute malevolence as on the other side, when in actual fact it's just a person who may or may not be fighting against them. But what this type of mass and popular culture does is it retains the instinct of the heroic, to transcend, to fight, to struggle, to not know fear, to, if one has fear, to overcome it in the moment, to be part of a group, but to retain individual consciousness within it, to be male, to be biologically defined, to not be frightened of death. Whatever religious or spiritual views and values that one incarnates in order to face that. These are, in a crude way, what these forms are suggesting. Morality is often instinctual, as is largely true with humans. I knew somebody who fought in Korea. When they were captured, the Koreans debated amongst themselves whether they should kill all the prisoners. And there were savage disputes between men. This always happens in war. I remember, as I near the close of this speech, that one of Sir Oswald Mosley's sons wrote a very interesting book, both about his father and about his experiences in the Second War. This is Nicholas Mosley, the novelist and biographer. And he was in the parachute regiment. And there's 2 stories that impinge upon the nature of the heroic that often appears in popular forms, and which I'll close with. One is when he was with his other members, he was with these other parachutists, and they were in a room, and the Daily Mirror, still going, the Daily Mirror, the organ of left-wing hate, which is the Daily Mirror, and on the front it said Oswald Mosley, who was then, I believe, being released from prison. The most hated man in Britain, he said, the most hated man in Britain. And the chap looked up from his desk, a sort of desk army wallah, you know, and looked at Mosley, who was leading a fighting brigade, and said, Mosley? He said, not related to this bastard, are you? And he said, I don't know if he's the eldest or the second son, but he said, I'm one of his sons. And total silence in the room. Total silence in the room. And they stared each other out, and the bloke's hands gripped the mirror. And all the other paratroopers were looking at this incident. And after about 4 minutes, it broke, and the other one tore up the mirror and put it in a bin at the back of the desk and said, sorry, mate. Didn't mean anything. Really? I didn't mean anything. And Moti said, well, that's all right then, old chap, isn't it? You know. And left. And the other story is very, very interesting. And this is they're advancing through France, and the Germans are falling back. And I believe I've told this story before at one of these meetings, but never waste a good story. And a senior officer comes down the track and says, Mosley? He says, Mosley, you're taking too many prisoners, Mosley. You're taking too many prisoners. It's slowing the advance. Do you understand what I'm saying, Mosley? And he said, certainly, yes, I totally understand what you're saying. He said, do you really understand what I'm saying? You're slowing the advance. Everyone's noticing it. Do something about it. Do you understand? Sir? And he's off to address another officer, further down. And Mosley turns to his Welsh sergeant major and says, what do you think about that? What he's saying? We're taking too many prisoners. Because, of course, what the officer has told him in a very English and a very British way is to shoot German soldiers and to shoot German prisoners and to shoot them in ditches. What else does it mean? You're slowing the advance. You're taking too many prisoners. You're not soft on these people, are you, Mosley? Speed the advance of your column. That's what he's saying, but it's not written down. It's not given as a formal and codified order. But everyone shoots prisoners in war. It's a fact. When your friend's had his head blown off next to you, you want revenge. I know people who fought in the Falklands. And some of the Argentinian Special Forces and some of the conscripts together used dum-dum bullets. Hits a man, his spine explodes. So when certain conscripts were found by British troops, they finished them pretty quickly at Goose Green and elsewhere. This will occur in all wars amongst all men, of all races and of all kinds, because it's part of the fury that battle involves. One of my views is that we can't, as a species and even as groups, really face the fact that in situations of extremity, this is what we're like. And this is why, in some ways, we create, for our entertainment, these striated forms of heroic culture where there's absolutely good and absolutely malevolent, and the two never cross over, and when the Joker is dragged off, justice is done, and Inspector Bowden, because it is he, rings Batman up and says, "Well done, you cleansed the city of a menace." And all the villains go to an asylum called Arkham Asylum. They're all taken to an asylum where they gibber insanely and wait for revenge against the nature of society. And I personally think that a great shadow has been cast for 60 years on people who want to manifest the most radical forms of political identity that relate to their own group, their own inheritance, their own nationality, their own civilizational construct in relation to that nationality, the spiritual systems from the past and in the present and into the future that are germane to them and not necessarily to the others, to their own racial and biological configuration. No other tendency of opinion is more demonized. In the entire West, no other tendency of opinion is more under pressure. Two things can't be integrated into the situationist spectacle based upon the right to shop, and they're religious fundamentalism and the radical right, and they're tied together in various ways. It's why the two outgroups, the most outgroups in Western society, are radical right-wing militants and Islamists. They're the two groups that are other, that are totally outside, that are, sort of and the way in which they're viewed by the Mirror and others is as almost the level of a Marvel comic villain, almost. I seem to remember a picture from the Sunday Telegraph years ago of our second speaker. And I'm quite sure that it had been retinted, at least this is my visual memory of it, to appear darker, to appear more sinister. I remember once GQ did a photo of me years ago when I was in a group called Revolutionary Conservative. That photo was taken in Parliament Square, the square that has Churchill and Mandela in it. That square near our Parliament. Oliver Cromwell's over there hiding. Boadicea over further on, hiding further on. But that photo was taken at 12:30, and it was a brighter day than this. But in GQ magazine, it was darkened to make it look as though it was shot at 9 o'clock. And everything was dark, and because it involved so much retinting, it slightly distorted and reconfigured everything. That's because these people are dark, you see. They're the force from outside. They're that which shouldn't be permitted. Whereas I believe that the force which is for light and the force which is for darkness, because I'm a pagan, can be brought together and used creatively and based upon identity and can lead on to new vistas. But that's a rather dangerous notion, and you won't find it in the Fantastic Four when Reed Richards and Dr. Doom do battle, and you won't find it in Spider-Man where Peter Parker and Dr. Octopus, Octavius do battle with one another. You won't see it with the Aryan Captain America taking on his National Socialist nemesis, the Red Skull. You won't see it with the Hulk taking on the Buddha. You won't see it in any of these forms, but these forms have a use, and that is that they build courage. And Nietzsche says there's two things at the end of Zarathustra you need in this life. You need courage and knowledge. That's why Zarathustra has two friends. He has an eagle, which stands for courage, and he has a snake, which stands for knowledge. And if you can combine those things and synthesize them, you have a new type of man and a new type of future. And Nietzsche chose the great Persian sage as his explicator of his particular truth, because in the past he represented extreme dualism, but in the future Nietzsche wished to portray that he brought those dualities together and combined them as one heroic force. Thank you very much. Warm applause for an even warmer room. Thanks very much. I'd like to now have a 20-minute burst or gap so that people can have a drink, and then we will have a speech from quite possibly the most controversial historian in the entire Western world. Thank you very much.